Ladies and gentlemen, Zura over here with more chess related content. Today is Tuesday, August 13th, 2024, and if you have been in the chess world, you probably know what happens on Tuesdays. That's right, Tile Tuesday on chess.com. All right, traditional online tournament that attracts all kinds of players, including Magnus Carlsen, Hikaru Nakamura, Fabiano Caruana, Alireza Firoza, you named. All professional chess players have participated in Tile Tuesday tournament from time to time. And I actually had my highest score last week, and I will link the video in the description in case you have not seen that and you want to check it out yourself. However, today's video is not about me. Today's video is about Jeffrey Xiong. If you do not know who Jeffrey Xiong is, where have you been, my friend? Now, Jeffrey Xiong is highest rated grandmaster from Dallas area, Dallas, Texas area, where I also reside, and I have seen ascending to the chess elite, and I would definitely love to see him back in 2700 club. Now, a little bit of a background here. After he peaked at, I believe, about 2720, or it says 2712 actually, in 2019, right after COVID situation, his rating started to decline. No one really knows what happened with him. If you Google his name here, first Reddit post that I see is actually what happened with Jeffrey Xiong. Not only his rating started declining, but he stopped participating at big events. And for us chess players, it is very hard to see because Jeffrey has always been known for his fighting spirit. And looks like something happened to that fighting spirit. He started playing very passive openings and lifeless chess, pretty much, you could say so. But today I saw something that I had not seen from him before, and I was very happy to see it, right? And what I mean by that is Jeffrey wins the Title Tuesday with 10 points out of 11 games, all right? If we scroll here, we can see that, oops, there we go. He scored 8 out of 8 games, beating Magnus Carlsen in game 8. Then he made 2 draws with Andrew Xiong and Alexander Bortnik. And then in the last round, he defeated German Grandmaster Matthias Bluebaum and won the tournament. All right, so I want to show you 4 games from today's tournament. Time control is 3+1. Let's jump right into it. First game that I'm about to show you was played in round 4 of the tournament. After winning first 3 games against lower rated opposition, Jeffrey got to play against Denis Kadric, a well-known figure in the world, I would say, world chess scene, but specifically Dallas chess scene. We actually went to University of Texas at Dallas together, and I know that Jeffrey and Denis have played a lot against each other. Jeffrey was ascending at the top while we were attending the university, so from time to time they had to play against each other at the tournaments quite a bit. All right, so it was good to see them battling it out again. And man, I saw something in this tournament that I haven't seen from Jeffrey in a long time, and I'm very happy to see that. Now, d4 knight to f6, Denis chooses to go for his traditional perk defense, d6, knight f6, g6, knight b7, e5. But in this situation, actually, in this game, he did not go for g6, knight f3, e5. Black balances the center after playing relatively not so active first few moves here, d6, knight d7. White has advantage in the center, but black's position is also very solid. This is the traction to a lot of players, including Hikaru, most notable. I think Hikaru plays this quite a bit. Bishop to e7, a4. a4 is prophylactic measure against potential c6, b5, and queenside expansion. For black, short castle, c6, here comes c6, rook to e1, h6. White brings all the pieces into the game so far in most optimal squares. Optimal probably meaning good and active at the same time and not weakening anything. h3, rook goes to e8, and Jeffrey decides to force the matters here with d5, right? Let me see what you're doing with your center. Black plays knight to b6 to attack this bishop. Bishop retreats back. C takes d5. E takes d5. And now we have this pawn structure where white will have queenside pawn majority versus this 3 pawns, for example, here. If we look at the black's queenside, right? However, now black has the pawn majority on the king side. 4 versus 3 here, right? These pawn structures actually quite common also in Najdorf Sicilian opening, all right? So quite popular with both sides, but I think this particular scenario favors white, as we'll see. a5, bishop to e3, bishop goes to f5, and white parks his knight on b5 since black had just played a5, trying to stop white's queenside expansion, right? Playing a5 themselves. So bishop goes to e4, c4, again, very standard idea to gain space on the queen side here. Knight bd7, and Jeffrey says, well, I could probably play knight d2, kick your bishop away, and then try to prepare this c5 push more, but you know what? I'm gonna go for it immediately, all right? D takes c5, sacrifice that pawn for the initiative, d6, kick the bishop away, knight to c7, winning an exchange at very least. However, as we'll see, he does not take that exchange because that knight is just as active as any of those rooks. Knight to h4, now trying to activate this knight. Black plays g5, asking the question, where is that knight headed towards exactly? Well, Jeffrey says, okay, I'm going to go back, bishop to g6. However, now with this g5, you may have weakened your king quite a bit. So why don't I try to exploit the weakness of that king side? h4, g4, knight goes to h2, now targeting this g4 pawn. h5, bishop goes to g5. So white is happy with this kingside action h5, g4, since now after grabbing that exchange, potentially white will have another plan of trying to attack on the king side. Queen goes to c8, bringing this knight back to f1 and into the game. Now black plays rook a7, threatening to move another rook away as well. So it is time to capture that exchange. Knight takes e8, knight takes back to e8, and now this knight that maneuvered h2 to f1 to weaken the black's king side now is back into the game from e3 and potentially d5. Right now from d5, it doesn't have a target immediately, but it wants to get to some active squares. I would say probably f6, c4 to attack this bishop, rook to c1, pinning now this pawn. Knight goes to c5. I believe this was the inaccuracy here. It would probably make more sense to, I'm not sure how, but basically do nothing kind of situation. Or maybe c4 was the inaccuracy already, and it would be better to bring this knight to d4. Yes, that actually looks pretty good for black. However, white still maintains the driver's seat here, according to the computer. Rook to c1, knight c5, bishop takes c4, knight c4, rook to c4. White cuts down that material deficit to only one pawn for the exchange. What I mean by that is exchange in chess is called when one side has a rook for a minor piece. All right, in this situation, rook versus a bishop, for example, and black has an additional pawn with that bishop, so that would be having a pawn for the exchange. All right, so rook versus bishop and the pawn, basically that's what that means. Queen e6, b3 here, and game wraps up relatively fast. After bishop g7, Jeffrey plays knight f4 to attack the queen and the bishop on g6, and I'm not exactly sure what happened with this, but this must have definitely been a mouse slip. Black gives up the queen simply on e6 and resigns immediately. All right, that was the game one that I wanted to show. I would say that fighting chess from Jeffrey, and this is what I mean when I said I was very happy to see him fighting. Now we'll see what happened in the next game against Sindarov. Sindarov is a very formidable opponent, 2700 Grandmaster, recently joined 2700 club, and he had also won the Olympiad, I believe, with Uzbeki team, right? A very strong performance from him in Uzbeki team with Nodirbek Abdusatorov. But he was also one of the big figures in winning that tournament, right? I actually played against Sindarov in the last title Tuesday myself. So game starts as French. Interestingly, Jeffrey goes for French. All right, I don't think that is his main repertoire. So this may mean that he may be switching. I don't know. Okay, I don't want to say. All these guys usually play all the openings, but still, it was interesting to see. Knight f3, bishop goes to d6, c4, knight f6. We have exchange French on the board. Bishop e2, short castle, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and white is okay accepting this isolated pawn on d4 since all pieces are still on the board. When all the pieces are still on the board, this usually gives white activity. e5 square could be taken with the knight and rook e1 occupying the open file. Actually, MVL, Maxime Vachier-Legrand, played this structure against me. That is to the date my highest rated win. All right, I also have included game of that, so you should check that out too. Now bishop takes c4, knight goes to c6, h3, h6. Both sides are trying to stop bishop g4, bishop g5, knight c3, and now black gets this bishop on another very comfortable diagonal here, h7, b1, rook e1, and knight goes to b4. Now hinting towards the c2 square, white will have to defend against that fork, right? And then black plays c6. In general, this is a very standard way to play against the isolated pawn. Side playing against it wants to block that pawn on d5, right? And that's what happens here, or at least what was his intention. That actually does not happen, because on knight e5, Jeffrey decides to trade that knight off with bishop takes e5, since d takes e5 is a little sketchy right now, because after trading queens here, knight f to d5, the c2 square might be problematic. All right, black is at least not worse already. So Sindarov decides to take on e5 with the rook. Bishop was hanging, so black had to move that bishop away. Rook back to e2, rook e8, offering the trade and insisting on this threat with knight c2. White gets the bishop out so that rook is not trapped in the corner and can come to c1. And meanwhile, black brings rook into the game on the d5. Now, I think black has made a lot of progress in the last few moves, because, as I said, side playing with isolated pawn tries to maintain pieces on the board. And black was able to trade one minor piece and the rook already. That will reduce the chances of white's initiative by a lot. All right, bishop to c7, rook d7, bishop to e5, and especially in blitz terms, play becomes much easier for black. All right, queen to d8, now putting the more pressure on this isolated queen's pawn. Rook to c1 and knight back to d5, blocking very safely the d4 square. Queen f3, knight takes c3, b takes c3. Now pawn structure has been changed a little bit here with knight c3, because that allows white to capture it with the b pawn, and now there is no more isolated pawn on the board. Knight goes to d5, bishop back to b3, f6, bishop is kicked back, bishop to f4. And one thing I want you to pay attention actually is the time situation here. Both players are now under seconds, but Sindarov has way less. 4 seconds compared to 17 is a big difference. b5, c4. I think this was a little suspicious to me. When you are that low on time, you probably want to just shuffle around, right? Bishop there, rook e1, not really go for complications. b takes c4, rook takes c4, queen to b6, apparently a blunder due to this move queen g4, but with just few seconds on the clock, finding accurate moves here is obviously very difficult. So Sindarov moves the bishop back to d2, bishop f7 to some safety here, rook c5 97, trying to trade the bishops. Apparently bishop h6 would be decisive here, but with a few seconds here again, seeing those kind of tactics. Here you have 2 seconds, white had 2 seconds, so they are basically trying not to flag, make any move, all right? And they play queen g4 immediately, f5, and queen h5, the critical blunder in the game. Now queen h5 might look smart because it is attacking this f7 bishop, and it is pinned by the bishop on b3. If bishop takes b3, I believe there will be queen e8 check, winning the rook on d7. However, what Sindarov forgot here is simply queen takes b3. Black sacrifices the queen first to eliminate that light squared bishop and then capture the queen on h5. So simple elimination defender tactic, but it is hard to judge a man when they have a second on the clock. That's literally how much they had here, second and a half. All right, so he takes game 5 basically. I think this was the closest he was to losing in this tournament. So then he goes on to win one more game, just to face the man himself, Magnus Carlsen, in round 8. All right, so going into this round, Jeffrey is 7 out of 7 and Magnus is 6.5 out of 7. All right, so I was more excited to see this game than the game that I was playing myself, actually, not gonna lie. All right, Magnus chooses to go for King's Indian. I think his thinking is, okay, I want to take him to the fighting territory because he seems to be not fighting that well recently. But little did he know that Jeffrey was ready. D6, bishop to e2, short castle, bishop e3, a very popular line recently against King's India. And instead of the main line, which is e5 here, Magnus chooses to continue with knight c6, d5, knight goes to e5, f4, knight back to d7. Now the point is, if knight jumps to g4, this bishop will retreat back, and now knight on g4 will be uncomfortable and kicked back with h3 on the next move. So black goes knight d7. This is still a theory. Knight to f3, e6 takes on e6, f takes e6, and immediately knight to g5, putting the pressure on e6. Queen goes to e7, since there was no e5 because there will be knight getting on e6, and anyways forking, can play knight c5 because bishop will capture that knight on c5, pawn captures probably then e5 with a very comfortable positional advantage. Queen goes to e7, short castle, b6. Now black needs to finish their development as well. I think another reasonable try here would be h6, kicking this knight back, but apparently this knight is going to come to h3, then bishop f3, knight f2, a very powerful idea, looks like. So Magnus decides to leave the knight on g5 and take care of the bishop, right? Try to get the bishop on the long diagonal and also jump the knight on c5, which would be protected with this pawn on b6. Bishop goes to f3, sliding the rook away from this e5 threat here. By the way, e5 from black is not an option because that will give white knight this d5 very comfortable square. You can't capture, oops, because queen d5, and there will be a fork. Rook goes to b8, queen to c2, bishop b7, rook a to e1. This is always a question here. Does this rook belong to d1 and the other one to e1? But since this rook was already on f5, probably it makes more sense to bring the other one on the e5. a5, king on h1, useful prophylactic move in general. Knight to c5, and as soon as knight lands on c5, posing problems to the white center, white decides to trade that dark square bishop off. Now, trading the dark square bishop in King's Indian is a big deal, right? Because it leaves black's dark square bishop unopposed. So if ever black gets attack going here, white will be in a difficult situation on the dark squares. However, white's idea here was very specific. He wants to simplify position and then go f5 and hint towards the white squares. Okay, white does not have much control of the dark squares, but they will have huge control of the light squares. All right, now this e6 pawn is a weakness. Here play e5, the knight lands on e6, rook moves away g4, and if you look at it, all the important things here for white is happening on the white squares. Literally nothing is standing on the dark squares except a few pieces here, which will be moved away from it shortly here. G takes f5, e takes f5, bishop f3, rook f3, sacrificing the g4 pawn here, but that is not for free. The g file now will be used for those two rooks to attack. Now, if you do not take on g4, white will push that pawn on g5 next, then knight d5, kicking the queen away. Either takes on g7, immediately f6. White is just running black over. Knight takes g4, rook gets on the g file, rook g1, queen h4 here. Black is trying to muddy the waters, but I think white's play is very easy. Double, triple, quadruple up on the g file and take whatever stands on the way. And that's kind of what happens here. Knight to e4, very nice detail, bringing the last piece into the attack. All white pieces were involved into the game, and I actually mentioned this in the last video as well. When in doubt, bring pieces to the party. Bring all your pieces to the party. You cannot go wrong with that. All right. Knight takes h2, trying to set up the little tactic here. If queen h2, then queen e4, but rook goes to h3 is lights out, because on the next move here, h2, knight is going to be lost. This knight is protected, so white now has extra material and attack still continues. So there is no hope. Queen takes g4 here, trading queen, and g7 bishop will be hanging afterwards. You have to move the rook back, and the finishing touch was actually very nice. All right. Pause the video, see what is the quickest way to the checkmate. Right. That is right. Knight to f6 is a checkmate in 2 moves. Black will have to capture back. Rook g7 will be the checkmate on the next move. So on knight f6, below actually what happened, Magnus timed out, right? It's very difficult to resign here. I think he was already a few seconds, and then he was not on time to click the resign button, all right? What a win! I am sure this should be a very motivating tournament victory for Jeffrey, and I think that specifically the game, okay? One game can change a lot, especially if you beat Magnus in a very convincing fashion. Never gave him a chance pretty much from the opening. And he took the driver's seat and finished the job without any chance. That was the critical win, I think, in the tournament. Then he drew his next 2 games. And in the last round here, I'm gonna show that one as well quickly. He played against Matthias Bluebaum. All right, this guy is also about 3100. So at this level, there are no easy games. All right, now Matthias chooses to go with the French defense, and a very interesting idea by Jeffrey. Knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5. You don't see bishop going on b5 too much in these structures. Usually bishop goes to d3 here with a very symmetrical play, but bishop b5, a6, chopping that bishop for the knight on c6, short castle, and then going for c4. Now c4 is another interesting way, I think, to expose black's weaknesses on the queen side here, specifically the c6 pawn and these double pawns. Because if white does not play on the queen side, then yes, black does have a weakness, but it's not so clear how can white take advantage of that, right? And on the king side here, black will have a bishop pair, but Jeffrey's idea was a little different here. I like this a lot actually. c4, d takes c4, bishop d2. Now wanting to take that pawn back, knight takes c4. If bishop e6, it won't change much. Queen c2, and then white will have taken on c4 on the next move. So Matthias gives it up immediately. Knight e7, knight takes c4, short castle, bishop to g5, bishop e6, rook to c1. Apparently computer evaluates this as about equal, maybe even slightly better for black, but I think practically it is much easier to play for white than it is for black. For example, if you go for a bishop pair here, that bishop pair will not mean much, right? Because there are not that many open files, and you have a clear weakness on c6. So let's say b3, queen c2, either threatening to take on d6 or play knight a5 and then win the c6 pawn that way. And where is black's target? Black has no target, all right? So bishop to d5, queen d3, g6, knight f d2, I believe bringing now this knight either to e4 or b3, rook b8, b3, rook to e8, not allowing knight e4, but all right, I'm going to bring my rook into the game, rook e1, king g7, knight lands on e4, asking the question, all right, what are you doing with your dark squared bishop? Are you going to take on g3 with the bishop? Are you going to take it there with the knight? Or are you going to leave it where it is? The answer was Matthias decides to leave it where it is, but now knight takes d6, takes there, and knight to c3. Well, now one bishop has been traded. Now white wants to trade another one as well. Queen f7, giving up the a6 pawn. I think that was simply a blunder. Honestly, they probably forgot about that pawn here, because after queen a6, black cannot take on d4 because the d6 pawn is hanging, right? So I think that's what black blundered here, the pawn. Queen takes a6, h5, queen gets back to d3. Thank you for the pawn. h4, bishop to f4. Now if g5, this bishop would simply go back. Actually, the f5 knight was hanging. Bishop e6, knight e4, and looks like white has won a pawn and will be winning the other one on c6, but he didn't capture there. I believe maybe bishop d5 and if rook c1, some sort of counterplay on the light squares. So he didn't want any of that. Was bishop back to d2, g5. Now is the time to go for that pawn. That's what happens here. h3, and the key move to simplify the position. g3 would probably give black long-term counterplay here with this g2 square, for example, takes their queen d5. Probably have to do something like that. Then takes, win the knight back. If you take there with the queen, what's the problem? Take back, rook takes e4, d5, and suddenly black is winning. Wow, I think this f3 square now will be the key. If rook e3, how is this winning? g4, wow, clamping the knight on f3, and this king will have to get stuck on h1, and basically then white pieces will have to be stuck on the first rank defending the king, and black will have all the time to do whatever they want, probably take these pawns and then bring the king over, right? But none of that. Knight c3, cold-blooded, attacking knight, bishop, and this h3 pawn will also be under attack if you move the knight away. That's what happens here. Queen takes h3, takes on d4, and position transposed into this situation where white has an extra pawn, extra two pawns, bishop for the knight, king is weak, and most white pieces are pretty safely protected here. So the rest is basically a technique, all right? A little bit of shuffling here. There goes the piece, queen f5 with the queen trade, and Matthias was trying to find some chances here since they were both playing on seconds. Now, with time on the clock, this is definitely resignable, but you cannot question a man for playing against an opponent when they have under 10 seconds, right? So that's what happens here. And the final trap. Now, Matthias set up here Eric Rosen trap. Rook goes to g2. Oh no, my rook. Are you gonna take it with the king? If you're gonna take it with the king, it is going to be a stalemate, actually. But Jeffrey is too good for that. He takes there with the rook and then promotes to a queen and checkmates on h5 to win the tournament with 10 out of 11. Alright, I should show here if we can see standings again. There we go. So that was full standings. All right, he wins it without a chance. Then Magnus ended up winning the rest of the game, so he caught up with, for the second place with 9.5, and then a bunch of people tied for the third place. All right, that was the tournament. Those were a few games that I wanted to show you. And now going back to the original question, is Jeffrey Xiong back? Well, I would very much love to see so, and I really hope that this tournament motivates him to get back into action and see Jeffrey that us Dallas chess fans are used to. Fighting, uncompromising, and critical in the openings. All right, cheers guys. I will see you on the next one. If you do like the video, please like and subscribe. It would help the channel a lot. I'll see you in the next one.